Hey everyone, I am Derek Weeks, and I am joined here by some esteemed colleagues and constituents from around the community, and we are going to talk about some software supply chain attacks that have happened recently. So first off, I'm joined by my colleague, co-founder and CTO of Sonatype, Brian Fox, who is here with us. We also have Dr. David Wheeler from the Linux Foundation. He is the Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security there. We also have Dr. Trey Herr from the Atlantic Council, who is the Director of Cyber Statecraft Initiative there at the Atlantic Council. So all of us spend a lot of time within our own organizations and within the community talking about software supply chains, talking about securing software supply chains. And that's really the base of the discussion that I wanted to gather you three here for today. Just to start off the discussion, I want to focus on some of the more recent news on software supply chain attacks, going to Brian and talking about a new or novel supply chain attack with namespace confusion that's happened within the NPM repositories and some others. But Brian, introduce us to kind of what happened, what the news was, and why maybe people should pay attention to this particular new form of attack.
Sure. With a lot of these things, they're only novel in that the rest of the world is paying attention to them. I think that's probably a pattern we can agree happened on most of these. So what happened in this instance is that NPM doesn't have a strong default namespacing schema. So what do I mean by that? You know, like in Java and Maven land, for example, we use the reverse DNS of a company to both be the sort of the base path for the classes, and Maven adopted that as well for the components. And in NPM, there wasn't one. When it very first was introduced, there was no possibility to have that. So you basically just have a very flat naming structure. They later, because they were running out of good names, I guess, was the lore, they added the concept called scopes, which was really a namespace. So you could have, company at my project, right? As opposed to just my project. The problem is it wasn't required, wasn't enforced. And, by the time it was introduced, I think a lot of patterns had been set in place. And so what this latest exploit takes advantage of is if you can figure out the name of a package being used internal to a company, not an open source project they're using, but an internal, my project, and you go to the public NPM repository and register and publish something called my project there, and you put it in there with a high enough version number, when NPM is trying to resolve the package, it's normally looking at multiple different sources, both internal and the public. And in this case, it's going to see, oh, I need the latest version of my project, and the one that happens to be in the public repository has a higher version. That's the one I'm going to get. Right. And so the researcher figured this out. For some of us, it wasn't new, but I guess I didn't certainly think to go collect a bunch of bug bounties when I wrote about it a couple of years ago, and I was talking about it back then because the Java modules group, when they were trying to figure out how to do naming for Java modules in JVM 9, was thinking about doing away with some of the namespacing. And I use this as an exact example of why not to do that, because what we have in Java and what we have in Maven is actually one of the better situations as compared to the other ecosystems. Let's not replicate that behavior, right? So that's the gist of what has happened there. And unless a company moves to using scopes or has other mechanisms in place, it can be very hard to defend against.
Yeah, and so this there were 30 some odd companies that were prone to this kind of attack that Alex Burson, who did the research, went out and kind of exposed, whether it was Apple or Zillow or Tesla or Amazon or whoever, creating packages, NPM packages that mimic the names of packages those companies were using internally. And if the build systems went to try and find the latest version, and they went externally to repos first to check that. They got his and not their own. And his weren't vulnerable, as far as we know. But a lot of copycats have since shown up. In the days following Alex's post about it, our post about it, I think 2 days later, we saw 275 copycats, something like that, appear, where people are like, cool, this is a way to stage an attack on a company that I know or wanted to target, or oh my gosh, Alex Person made $130,000 in bug bounties, and the guy lives in Romania, and that's got to be a fortune for him. I should go out and do the same thing, because hey, what a way to make $130,000 in 6 months.
Yeah.
What am I doing here? David, you're focused on open source software supply chain security. This kind of news comes along. What was your thought on reading about this research?
I think the earlier comment about we've seen attacks like this before. In fact, if you want to go much further back, if you squint a little bit, decades ago, when people were typing in commands into their terminals to make a program run, we had a very similar problem with what's called paths, where if you typed in the name of a program, which program runs? Is it the program you intended, or some other program that maybe an attacker slipped on? So we've seen this kind of namespace confusion before. It's just another instance of it. And we talked briefly earlier. I think what we need to do continuously is learn from attackers, learn what they do, build our systems where possible so that they're secure by default. In this case, obviously, that's not happened. So I think in the shorter term, there are some quick steps. Microsoft actually posted some things. And by the way, although Java has some countermeasures, I mean, there's still room for problems within Maven and so on anyway, for this kind of attack. So I think in the shorter term, there's some quick countermeasures you can do, but in the longer term, we need to build into our package managers ways so that by default, it's secure. If you have multiple repos, and for many organizations, that's a reality, then make sure that for any given name, there's exactly one repo that's going to map to, no more, no less. And that actually, and there's many ways to do that. I don't care nearly so much the details. We just need to make it so that when you use a package manager, and you need to, it automatically works in the way you expect it, no surprises. And I know that some folks are already working on that within the various package managers. But that's something that we basically need to do is, wait a minute, we've got a problem. We need to fix that so that and unfortunately what that's going to mean for some folks is that those package managers are going to need to be updated. And now the other heavy lift, people are going to have to use those mechanisms and make changes because the earlier defaults weren't secure, unfortunately.
Yeah. Even when this capability, I mean, I know Brian and I were talking about this internally. The capability existed internally in lots of people's technology to configure it in a way where this didn't happen, and you didn't need to be at risk. Now, the thing that we talked about is, have you gone in and done that configuration within your build pipeline? If no, you need to. If you didn't know how to do that, then you need to learn how to do that, and you need to actually take action on this. Before we went live, David and I were joking about lessons learned, and he said something like, we shouldn't call these lessons learned because we keep repeating the same old mistakes, and maybe we should just refer to it as lessons learned by a few, and not practiced by many. But before we get carried away on that, Dr. Herr, when it comes to software supply chain attacks, and you heard about this attack, what was your kind of reaction to it within the Atlantic Council and the communities that you serve?
I feel like I echo Brian and David to some extent. Everything old is made new again. What's amazing is we put together this project, Breaking Trust, starting back in September 2019, as a way to catalog attacks and significant vulnerability disclosures on the software supply chain, and put out our first report in July of 2020, capturing 115 attacks and disclosures over 10 years, which was more than I'd ever run into anecdotally. But I think as we, especially in talking with you all and profiling open sources, a lot fewer than are going on at any given basis in some ways. What's interesting though is that there's this trend where it's the same combination of a handful of techniques played over and over again against libraries, against projects, against repositories that just don't have the kind of basic mechanisms in place to stop those attacks, either from being effective or from being just so damn cheap. And so I guess when I saw this, it was just, oh, here we go again at a different scale, maybe a little bit harder to detect. And in this case, I think what was interesting was going after an intriguing seam in the open source ecosystem, which is this private repo of otherwise open and common code. And so that's something where, as we see folks on this call and others advocate to really get people to understand just how much open source exposure they have, oh, no, I'm a proprietary, code user. It's like, no, you're using a lot of open source. It's just one step down the dependency chain from the package that you have. I think it's been interesting to see folks reevaluate just how much perceived security they're getting from that isolation of a private repository, which I think hopefully is a good thing, right? There's nothing magic about isolation or security through obscurity. And so if this is driving a little bit of improvement in awareness and basic behavior and just maintaining the health of those libraries and some of that code, I think it's a positive thing. But yeah, the song just remains the same with this as over and over again.
If we're, I don't know if anyone's published any research or comments on this, but if you look at, we're talking about open source packages in this particular case, and proprietary packages and open source packages and which repo you're getting those from. But if you think about containers, do we have the same problem with containers? Can I put anything up on Docker Hub and allow anyone to download it and call it apple.apple. Whatever container package? And
Docker has a namespace in it. It's similar to GitHub. It's the project or the organization that published it. So yes, you could. I don't know if they validate. If I show up and try to be, insert company name, I'm not sure how the validation works there. But there is at least the mechanism in place to make it more obvious that you're getting, my project from the wrong company.
Yeah, I think that if I remember correctly, there are some kind of certified repos within Docker Hub. If you go to Docker Hub and you search, that you would see here's the official one. But if you have a build tool just going out and calling for a name, I don't know what mechanisms exist within that, but certainly something to review in terms of how builds are done or what kind of infrastructure or code is pulled in to the platform.
If I can jump in quickly though, regarding Docker, I think Docker does have, like almost any repo, the problem of what's called typo squatting. And I know all of you are very familiar with this, where you make a name that's similar to the package you intended, and it's not that hard to double check a name, but too many people don't. And so even if there's something, or if there's a namespace registered, if you can fool somebody that Apple with 3 P's is the Apple you were expecting, it's probably going to result in a bad day.
Yeah. It seems, it feels kind of ridiculous. Like, who types in Apple with 3 P's? Like, would that really happen? But yes. when I'm writing every day, I was writing one of my colleagues, Alyssa, today, and I needed to type in her email address into something, and I misspelled it. Like, how many things do I misspell each day, just off one letter, in the name? And yet that same kind of behavior in coding could end up bringing in, something masquerading to be something else.
Yeah, well, when you factor in that many people are just searching for stuff, and if the downloads are driven up, as we've seen in some of the malicious attacks, they set up bots to drive the downloads through the roof. So if you search for a thing, it's probably going to be the number one hit. It's got a lot of downloads. It looks right. I'm going to grab those coordinates and drop it in. So it may not even be a typo per se, but they're manipulating the way you discover what the thing is. Maybe you don't remember the name exactly, or whatever. You just search for it and it looks about right. Off I go. That's what I think is happening a lot.
It's got the name, 3 million downloads. It's popular in the open source community. I pick other components because they're popular. So
that's probably the one I meant to find, right?
Yeah.
These are right. I think as we're saying, right, these are not robust authentication mechanisms. These are search mechanisms. It's metadata and a mechanism to find and sort code. So I think it's interesting. At least it was for us. And I think in reading, reports from Sonatype and the work that folks at Linux Foundation are doing or others, just to try to get the baseline behavior into something where you're not pulling packages, you're not pulling code into your product or into a production system that you haven't validated the source of in some other way. And I think one of the areas that, we're really excited to see some growth, especially with the repositories, is setting some very rudimentary, very easy to hit bars in terms of governing that code, how it's identified and what sort of behaviors are allowed in terms of what's being submitted and what's being pulled, if only because these are one of the handful of good points of concentration in this ecosystem. And I don't think we want to impose new barriers or, new sort of artificial points of concentration just as a way to solve this broader governance problem.
It's funny that you say that. It's near and dear to my heart because we've been taking heat for 15 years on Maven Central for exactly that, right? Because we do require that you can prove you own the domain that the coordinates are matching to, or the GitHub project, right? We have validation. And for years and years, people, do drive-bys on Twitter, like, can't you just make it easy like NPM? Why do I need to wait half an hour for your bots to validate? I don't want to do this. I just want to publish my stuff, it feels like a little bit, people are starting to understand why we had that in place this whole time. And hopefully we'll see that all the other communities recognize that is actually an important thing that we need to do, that sometimes you have to have a little bit of a trade-off from the super easy to publish thing because it protects the community from those kinds of things. So it's not going to protect all the things, but if you have that validation mechanism, it allows you to catch things like typo squats or somebody pretending to be, Apache when they're not Apache, these kind of basic things. It at least makes it harder for the bad guys instead of it being just super easy for anybody to do it, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So for all of you guys, one of the other subjects I wanted to get to for our audience is, you guys are out speaking to various communities all the time. You publish reports, you publish blogs on the topic of securing software supply chains. Is there one point over the years or, even recent months, if it is, that you keep coming back to? And we've talked about just, focus on the simple, right? This is not necessary. There are complex ways to solve this, but there are also simple ways. Is there, a simple suggestion that you always come back to with the audiences that you're talking to, or maybe a research point or a stat from your research that, like, look, if you're going to leave with anything, this is what, I want you to leave with. Dr. Herr, is there something from the report that you guys published at the Atlantic Council on securing software supply chains that always comes up in conversation or you always want to bring up?
I'd love to have a silver bullet, and we've been asked by a number of entities, just tell us the one thing we can do. Like, this is all great, but what's the one? I'm like, there's probably not one thing. So I think we tend to lead with one of two ideas. Conceptually, the thing that I found resonates most is that how you trust has to be at least as important as who you trust. And one of the observations that we made, especially in talking with policymakers, is there's a tremendous amount of focus on provenance. Where are these products coming from? Who's building them? Which cyber criminal group may or may not have had their hands on this? And very little rigor or attention to the process of how that trust is established and how it's maintained as it's transferred between entities. So I think part of what we're hoping to see in the discussion in the next 18 months that SolarWinds has kicked off, unfortunately for them and for the victims of the incident, but hopefully positively for the rest of us, is a much more explicit treatment of the mechanisms that we use to establish trust. Not just sort of hoping that anything can be signed and running away. Because the NPM attacks are a really good example of something where you wouldn't necessarily have imposed a rigorous authentication barrier, right? Or an integrity barrier, right? In trying to establish whether or not that code was still trustworthy. Even within a build process, going back in and revalidating between cycles and commits, I think is something we're seeing is really important. Probably the more actionable piece of this, and this is a longer conversation that we're having with NIST, is a lot of the discussion about software security in the last 15 years has been characterized by an explicit focus on development, which was a good problem and a good discussion. SDLC was, a necessary outgrowth of a lot of these efforts. We've seen a lot of standards work in that area. But part of the shortfall that we found in that research was that there's very little work that's been done on secure deployment relative to secure development. And so those two are really co-equal. And need to be part of a mutually reinforcing system of standards. And so where we are hoping to push folks right now is just in taking what's out there and cobbling it together into a NIST overlay, right? One place where any vendor, any developer can go to recognize, okay, this is what the industry, this is what government sort of believes are best practices in terms of secure deployment of code and management through a life cycle, as opposed to just secure development. I'm hopeful we'll see some growth there, because I think that's one thing that would really raise all boats in a not huge but meaningful way.
Yeah, and maybe I didn't ask you beforehand if you were prepared to talk on it, but President Biden released an executive order last week about securing government supply chains, physical supply chains, digital supply chains, software supply chains. Any major kind of pickup on that? You had to know that was expected coming after SolarWinds, that there would be some executive order coming on that. But how does that change life in the government entities that you work with?
I think realistically, the Sunburst executive order is still to come. I think that was a supply chain executive order, thinking much more broadly about physical goods and commodities, pharmaceuticals, microelectronics. And so it's good to see some studies being done. I think they'll probably come back with information that we've known for a long time. But if that's the way to kick that process off for DoD in particular, but I think for this government and commerce, that's a good thing. But I think there is more still to come on software.
Right. David, let's shift to you. What's the one piece of advice or direction you give to audiences and communities?
So I'm going to repeat that. There is no one magic bullet. But there are some things. As long as you admit that there is not just one thing. One we've already mentioned before is learn from history. Okay, it's incredible how many times we see attacks that are the same old attacks. We just discussed typo squatting. Typo squatting is not new. As far as open source goes, there's a study, academic paper, Backstabber's Knife Collection, which found that the majority of the malicious open source project come in through typo squatting. It's not that they're subverted, well-established programs. It's a name that's similar to the one that you intended. And so, learn how are attackers attacking? How can I mitigate? And in that case, for example, simple things like double checking the name. Yes, I'm aware that attackers sometimes try to increase the downloads, but that doesn't change the date that that package was added. If that package has 1 million downloads and it just appeared last week, that's actually more suspicious. Okay. Another thing which I've already mentioned, secure by default. And really that goes for any time you write software. Your users will use the software. If you have to add extra text to explain how to use it securely, then you built it wrong. You should have to add extra text to explain how to use it insecurely. All right. I think probably many people have harped on this before, but learning how to develop secure software, that still is pretty unusual. Most software developers don't get any education, any training on how to develop secure software. And that's including the ones who go through school in a computer related degree program. About half in the US don't do that. So, I'll be happy to mention, Linux Foundation has a free course on the fundamentals of how to develop secure software on edX. Go take it, go take something else, but learn how to do it. I think those are at least kind of get you started. Learn from what the attackers are doing, secure by default, learn stuff. And he mentioned there was a mention about the operational with DevSecOps. Increasingly, those worlds are getting connected anyway. So we do need to learn how to deploy securely, but increasingly that's by working together with everybody else. It's not really an isolated world for most people anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a interesting point that you bring up. One, I think we've repeated this, again and again. The same kinds of attacks are just happening over and over. And like I know, reading like the Verizon data breach reports or other things, like email is still the number one way that people get in. In terms of software vulnerabilities, Struts is still in the top 10 and like always is year after year after year. It's like, okay, we know there are vulnerable versions. Why are you still using vulnerable versions, or surprised that you're being breached through vulnerable versions? Like it wasn't new when Equifax came around. There were numerous Struts related breaches long before that, and they continue to be in the top 10, each year. But I think that, the point that you bring up about training for software developers and what's available and what's encouraged even, is important for organizations just to go out and encourage developers to get the training or to provide the training. But it feels fairly daunting if we think about, I don't know, if you go by GitHub's numbers and you think there are 35 million software developers around the world, how do you train 35 million people at scale, right? And what kinds of things do you introduce that make that experience valuable for everyone and kind of gives everyone a training path?
If 35 million people showed up on edX and took that fundamental security course, I think edX would be happy and the world would be happy. And to be fair, I'm the one who primarily wrote the course, so of course I'm going to like my own course. But in the broader scheme, I don't care if you take that course or something else. The problem here is we've got a lot of developers who are writing software that's under attack, and they're totally unprepared for the situation. No one has told them what to do, even the very, very basics. And we need to move. We should be unsurprised. In fact, we should expect that our software is vulnerable. Of course it is. No one's told them how to do it differently. And so that doesn't solve everything. We still need to make things secure by default, that sort of stuff. But having a little knowledge is a big plus, and we need to get to that point.
Brian, I'm going to shift to you. What's the thing that you are continuously bringing up with every audience and community that you're talking to? There's no silver bullet, but what are the things that you feel like you probably repeated 100 times and will need to repeat 100 more times?
Oh, where to start? The one I've been on lately, as I'm sure you've heard me talk about, is trying to educate mostly application security professionals to the fact that the battle has shifted upstream a bit towards what's happening within development, right? So take the namespace confusion problem. We're now living in a world where the mere act of the developer downloading the package as a dependency causes it to get executed, or at least some of the parts of it get executed, which literally means the attack happened right there. The developer downloaded the dependency, maybe before they even wrote a line of code that included it. And so historically, what really has been happening is application security is set up to be defense, to make sure that they don't ship insecure stuff to their customers, right? So that's where you see, especially in less agile organizations, before we ship, it must go through a static scan or some other kind of criteria. They're defending against shipping it to their users when today's battlefield is going on inside your development, right? And so, Derek, we were talking about this before in the context of Deming, right? Like all of Deming's principles as they apply to DevSecOps make perfect sense. You need to do those. Those are table stakes. But Deming was not guarding against somebody trying to sabotage the factory, right? So you can do all those practices and still get your development factory sabotaged. You need to do more. You're missing the battle, right? So that's the conversation that I keep trying to have, because so much of the practice is about fighting last decade's war, and completely missing what's actually happening right now, right? And so, in some ways, you have to be much more proactive, much more on the front end of what developers are downloading and consuming to prevent that from even happening. Because by the time they've done it, just yesterday we found two more. They were the first ones that we uncovered. With the namespace thing, we saw wave one was all of Alex's stuff. Within 48 hours, there were hundreds. Within a week, it had exploded by 7,000%. The copycats after bug bounties, but I had speculated there's going to be a third wave. We're not sure. We might already be in it, but we weren't sure at the time, of people actually doing this to steal real things. Yesterday, we put our finger on two of them where the component was stealing your bash history and the Etsy shadow password cache file, right? So depending on how you use your system, there can be a lot of sensitive information just in your bash history if you were typing passwords on command lines, as an example. So, the mere act of people consuming that meant those two things were potentially sent off to wherever the bad guy was from, right? That's a totally different war than what I think traditional AppSec is set up to defend against. That's the thing that I'm constantly pushing and trying to raise awareness on.
Yeah, I think that's I haven't thought about it in that way, but I like how you really positioned that is AppSec, application security, was really about looking at this thing before it goes into production, or when it's in production, making sure that no one's attacking that. And I've verified that is safe to deploy or operate out there, or I can protect it when it's operating out there. But application security shifting to include securing application development, right? Part of the role and responsibility is on the development team. How are you coding? What are you coding with, etc. But if you think about the SolarWinds attack, right? There's part that is, as software developers, what were we doing to try and prevent that type of attack? But as application security, what are we doing as application security to protect how applications are being developed, where there are multiple layers of things that could be done in development or by security, and that layered approach, defense in depth kind of approach to security when it comes to software supply chains and development. That's a great perspective on, if you're a CISO or if you're an AppSec leader, thinking about this, am I application security, or am I securing application development, or am I doing both? What is that kind of role within your organization? Dr. Herr,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, David.
I was going to say, I'm not so sure it's such a good idea nowadays to split those. I remember, back in the 1980s, you'd reuse the operating system, you'd reuse a database, and that's maybe a library. But over the years, development has been shifting increasingly to reusing software. Historically, the problem was we didn't know how to develop software that was reusable. Hooray, we solved that problem. Now we have a new problem. We can reuse a lot of software. There's an old wag, the cause of problems is previous solutions. The vast majority of most applications are reused software. Okay, vast majority, and Sonatype's even done some analysis to show this. So, and so we should be unsurprised that the attackers are going to where the biggest vulnerabilities are. That doesn't mean we can't reuse software. It just means that because it's now part of the attack surface for development of software, we need to defend that as part of the way that we develop software. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break in, Trey.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, when we think about the trend in software development at a systems level, right, the move towards microservices and containerization, I think there's a very similar trend towards decomposition, away from monolithic programs and single developer tools into these, highly complex set of relationships. Really, it's almost a small family of nested features and code bases developed by different entities over time. And so I agree with David completely in that I think part of the challenge is that, and we've talked about this before, right? The way that we assess and manage risk in the software supply chain just hasn't kept up with the way we use software and the way we build software. And so I think that's an area where a concerted effort to shift norms forward into rigorous validation and integrity checking at each of those seams, as those seams multiply throughout a code base and throughout a system, is really critical. That's not an easy technical solution, right? I mean, I think in some cases we're talking about fairly low-level message passing services, or things that are wired together in some very unconventional ways, not called as traditional dependencies, or packaged in a way that can be validated by a single, this binary has been vetted by, this testing suite. But I don't think that stops us, and really shouldn't, if only because this seems to be where we're going for a long time. And I think, again, maybe if we're pulling out a little bit, is really good. The democratization of development in a way where, if you have the ability to write one feature and you can pull all the rest of the functionality you need for a piece of software together, that's fantastic. You don't have to be able to write everything from, an ISA all the way up. So I think we have to embrace that as a realistic trend, but that does mean changing in some ways, just like we did with networks and the enterprise model in the 2000s, like changing the security boundary away from, well, it's this program, it's been validated, like all the way down to feature by feature, module by module, which is hard, no question.
Yeah. But I like what you said before, and I didn't comment on it at the time, but it's, kind of boils down to who do you trust and how do you trust? I think that's a kind of a great perspective to go on as you think about how are we securing software supply chains? How do we think about this? You did bring up provenance earlier. I've talked to various people along the way about provenance of components, whether those are packages or containers or any kind of reusable code, reusable build tools that I'm bringing into my organization, supply chains that are not on premises, but in the cloud, or development pipelines that are in the cloud that were once on premises. There are a lot of probably more unanswered questions in that provenance area that I don't know if even exposing them solves the problem, just with how software is developed in a community basis, the way it is today. When I look at Java ecosystems, and I report on this each year in the State of the Software Supply Chain report, but looking at 15,000 Java development organizations, they're relying on 3,400 open source projects on average, right? You can't go and assess every single one of these in the provenance of, well, what is that project? Who's working on it? How long have they been working on it? Are all those trusted people in that? And multiply that across languages or other parts of the infrastructure. It feels like an impossible task if Trey, you're asking me, who do you trust and how do you trust? Like, how do I answer that?
You know what? I think that's a good problem for us, right? Is that we've gotten to, just like the growth of the internet out of NSFNet in the 80s and 90s, right? I can't own the phone book anymore. I can't tell you who's on the other end of the line in a lot of cases and what breed of dog they are. So I think for where we are, in some ways, what we're saying is we're missing the effort, the really community-led effort to come in and say, regular open standard, reasonably easy, low overhead set of protocols to come in and validate through whatever mechanism, to whatever standard we think is appropriate, any code you're receiving outside of your hands, because it's a lot more than you think. That there's jury rig solutions right now, and certain companies can sell something that you can sort of wrap part of your build process in. That's good, but that's not sustainable or scalable or really accessible to a lot of the small open source developers. So I think here, there's one of the few places when we talk about a governance challenge that there is actually an opportunity for a technical solution. And I say like one of the very few, not as a magic solution, but as a way to start to build a substrate in where I can talk about what information I'm expecting from you, that I can pull from your resource, not wait for you to push to me with a new update, right, or a new version. And what information does that have? And then have the debate, is that enough? Is the mechanism of how I'm establishing that trust sufficient? Do I want to modify it to my own ends? If I'm the intelligence community, do I want to know more or different things than if I'm Walmart? But I think we're not there yet. We're sort of missing that base layer almost.
Yeah. There are a lot of conversations around that. I know within the Linux Foundation, NTIA on software bill of materials, and so forth, being part of that, like, can you pull out some information, as you say, and then begin to question, is that enough? But I want to go to our final kind of wrap up topic, because I think we could go on for hours on this conversation. But let's give people some place to go to learn something. If I want to take the next step, give me a place to go. It's your report that you produced, a blog that you wrote, a resource or training that is available. What would you suggest and lead people toward? I'll start with Brian and then go to David and Trey.
Yeah, if you're interested in some of the attacks that we were talking about, the namespace stuff, our blog at Sonatype has a whole bunch going back a long time, as well as more information on some of the history of that. So I think there's a lot of bleeding edge information that we've been pushing out there that should be of interest.
All right, David, where would you send people?
Multiple places, actually. So it depends on what you're interested in. I work at the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation has kicked off open source security foundation, OpenSSF.
Mm-hmm.
And they're actively working right now in dealing with some of these things. For example, they're genning up some tools to monitor the various repos, and then various other tools to take that monitor data and then analyze it and ask questions like, wait a minute, does this look malicious? Does this look like typo squatting? That sort of thing. They're also working on many other things. They've also included something called the CI Best Practices Badge. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. Let's see here. That would be bestpractices.coreinfrastructure.org. And so if you're an open source project, work to get a badge that basically is a list of best practices, assuming that you want to be secure, things like have version control, tell people how to report vulnerabilities, run tools to look at your code. Another thing that we just mentioned was courses. So openss.org/edx-courses, all lowercase. We'll give you some courses. Fourth and final, we talked about SolarWinds. In the short term, we need to harden up our build environments. That is not going to work against nation state adversaries. I'm sorry, that's just not going to be adequate to counter that. The only measure that I know of for counting a SolarWinds style attack is something called reproducible builds. And there is a website, reproducible-builds.org. That's a harder road to hoe, no doubt of that. But right now, that's the only game in town when you're trying to counter those kinds of attacks. And we could talk about that later. So anyway, yeah. You got a forfer.
Awesome. So Trey, you mentioned NIST standards and NIST guidance before, but where would you send people in addition to the NIST research and publications that have been put out there?
So I think that the NIST research and the NISTers in particular have been some really good sources of information. I would definitely claw through the Linux Foundation. I think there's a lot of resources scattered throughout that page, and I think some really interesting programming work being done there. The other thing I would look at, honestly, is there's some really good work being done by the folks at In-Q-Tel Labs. So Ben Tozer and John Speed Myers, and of course the inimitable Dan Geer, around secure code reuse and trying to frame not only the operational aspects of this, but almost the sort of system design and system theory side of secure code reuse, and in ways that are really going to be useful both to practitioners in industry, but also the policy community trying to wrap their head around some of these problems. The fixes that are coming, the ways that folks are trying to address shortfalls in federal cyber risk management and in some cases in industry are good, and there's a lot of good energy I think that's been kicked up by the Sunburst crisis, but some of these are much longer roads to hoe, and I think need the sort of sustained energy that we've seen from folks like, the group pushing on SBOM and NTIA and Alan Friedman's shop. So I think there's some really good framing in the In-Q-Tel worlds thinking about these problems that helps map out that longer frame.
Yeah, one, thank you all for this conversation. It's always great to talk to each of you about what's happening, both and most importantly, kind of short term, right? What do we need to be aware of? Short term, what kind of actions can we take? But I think you've each brought up different initiatives that really have a long-term focus. If you're out there listening to this saying, I want to get involved, there are enough places to get involved. We don't necessarily need new places, but just more investment and more people and more brains on here are the things and the people that are thinking long-term on these initiatives. How can we work to better improve application security, securing application development, secure coding practices, et cetera, because there's no immediate path to or silver bullet that we can apply here, as we said. So this will be an ongoing story, and we just need more brains in the industry, focused on contributing toward solutions and thought leadership in this space. So, Dr. Wheeler, Dr. Herr, Brian, thank you so much for participating today. And we'll wrap it up there.